At 35,000 feet, in the silence of first class, a little boy was drowning in a storm no one else could see, until a shy little girl did the unexpected. "Sir, please, control your son." The words sliced through the polished air of first class, sharp with irritation. Passengers shifted, rolling eyes, muttering under their breath. In seat 2B, a boy of only 3 sat rigid, his small chest jerking with frantic, shallow breaths. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched, his eyes wide with a terror too big for words. Beside him, Breckenridge Davenport, software magnate, master of control, a man who could bend corporations to his will, was helpless. His hand hovered near his son's knee, trembling, useless. "Buddy, it's okay," he whispered, but his voice was drowned out by the boy's silent scream. Judgmental stares pressed in like a noose. First class demanded order, and his son was chaos incarnate. Then, from 40 rows back, a quiet figure unbuckled her seatbelt. An 11-year-old girl, red-haired and silent, walked the aisle. She didn't speak, didn't argue. She only said, "I think he needs me." Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. Not all storms have rain, and not all battles have soldiers. On Flight 712 to Seattle, the worst kind of battle was brewing, and the only person who knew how to fight it was an 11-year-old girl who hadn't spoken a word since takeoff. The air in first class was different. It was a carefully manufactured calm, crisp and cool, smelling faintly of expensive leather and hot towels. It was the air of people who did not wait in lines, who did not check the price, who did not hope for a good seat because they had already bought the best one. Each passenger was an island, protected by a moat of unspoken rules and quiet courtesy. They read financial papers or typed silently on glowing laptops. This was a world of order, of control. In seat 2A sat Breckenridge Davenport, a man who embodied that control. Breck was the architect of a software empire that managed global supply chains with terrifying precision. He was a man who saw the world as a series of problems, and every problem had a solution that could be bought, coded, or leveraged. His suit was a custom weave, a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the light. His watch, a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, did not tick. It swept, a silent, relentless measure of the time he was worth. People who worked for him said he could find a flaw in a balance sheet from 100 feet away. They said his silence was louder than another man's shouting. They were right. But the problem beside him could not be solved with money or intimidation. In seat 2B was his son, Callan. At 3 years old, Callan was a miniature version of his father in appearance only. He had the same dark hair and serious brow, but his eyes were wide with a terror that had no name. He was not crying. It was something worse. His small body was rigid, his back pressed so hard against the leather seat it seemed he was trying to become part of it. His tiny fists were clenched, knuckles white. His breathing was a series of short, sharp gasps, a desperate engine on the verge of stalling. The world inside the airplane, the gentle hum of the engines, the sterile scent of the cabin, the soft, intrusive murmur of voices, was an assault. Breck placed a hand on his son's knee. It was like touching stone. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice a low, practiced calm that betrayed the frantic wiring in his own mind. "Look at me. We're okay. We're just flying." Callan's head tilted back, his mouth open in a silent scream. His world had shrunk to a pinpoint of pure, overwhelming sensation. His father's voice was just another noise in the storm. Breck felt a familiar, hot spike of frustration mixed with a helplessness that was utterly foreign to him. He could command a boardroom of sharks and bend them to his will. He could predict market shifts with uncanny accuracy, but he could not reach his own child. He could not calm the storm raging inside the small boy beside him. Across the aisle, a woman in pearls shot him a look that was 1 part pity and 2 parts annoyance. She adjusted her silk scarf. Breck saw the look and his jaw tightened. He knew what she was thinking. Control your child. As if a child's terror was a switch that could be flipped. As if love was the same as obedience. He'd seen that look 1,000 times. In restaurants. In parks. In the waiting rooms of specialists who offered expensive diagnoses but no real cures. He fumbled in his briefcase, his fingers brushing past million-dollar contracts to find a small, worn teddy bear. He offered it to Callan. The boy didn't see it. He was lost, adrift in a sea of sensory chaos. Breck's shoulders slumped. He felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. He was Breckenridge Davenport, a king in his own world. But here, he was just a failing father. 40 rows back, beyond the thin curtain that separated two worlds, the air was different. It was recycled, smelling of packed bodies and stale coffee. Here, in the tight quarters of economy class, there was no pretense of solitude. Knees bumped, elbows jostled. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. In seat 42C, Cassidy Rowan was looking out the window, but she wasn't seeing the clouds. Cassie was 11 years old, with a cascade of fiery red hair that fell over her shoulders. She was pale, with a dusting of freckles across her nose. To most people, she seemed impossibly shy. A quiet girl, lost in her own thoughts. She hadn't said much to her grandmother since they'd settled into their seats. She simply watched. She watched the way the flight attendant's smile never quite reached her eyes. She noticed the nervous tick of the man in the row ahead, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on his thigh. Cassie saw the details others missed because she spent more time listening than talking. It was a skill her grandfather had taught her. Beside her, Alara Rowan held a worn paperback book, but her eyes were on her granddaughter. Alara had a kind, weathered face, etched with the lines of a life lived with patience and quiet strength. She knew Cassie's silence wasn't emptiness. It was observation. It was thought. He used to say you learn more with your ears open and your mouth shut. Alara said softly, not looking up from her book. Your grandpa, I mean. Cassie gave a small nod, her eyes still fixed on the window. They were flying to dedicate a small plaque in his honor at the Veterans Memorial. Sergeant Thomas Rowan. A hero, they called him. A man who had seen too much and spoken of it too little. But he had spoken to Cassie. He hadn't told her war stories. He had told her about the importance of being still. He had taught her how to listen to the world, not just with her ears, but with her whole self. He had struggled with the noise of the world when he came home. Crowds were hard. Loud noises were harder. Cassie had learned from a young age how to be a calming presence for him. She learned that sometimes the best way to help someone who is shouting on the inside is to be quiet on the outside. A faint, distressed sound from the front of the cabin reached them. It was almost imperceptible at first, a high-pitched, rhythmic whimper that was half human, half animal. Most passengers ignored it, cocooned in the bubble of their headphones or conversations. But Cassie heard it. She felt it. It was a sound she recognized. It was the sound of someone trapped. She turned from the window, her brow furrowed. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Someone's hurting." Alara looked up, her gaze following Cassie's toward the front of the plane. She could hear it now, too. A man's strained, low voice, trying to soothe. Then the child's panicked gasps again, sharper this time. "Some children don't like flying," Alara said gently, a note of compassion in her voice. "It can be frightening for them." But Cassie shook her head. Her eyes, a deep and thoughtful green, were filled with a certainty that went beyond her years. "No," she said. "It's more than that. He's loud." Alara looked at her, puzzled. "He's barely making a sound, sweetheart." "Not on the outside," Cassie insisted, her gaze locked on the distant curtain. "On the inside. Grandpa was loud like that sometimes." The understanding that passed between them was deep and unspoken. Alara knew exactly what she meant. Thomas's quietest moments were often his most turbulent. Up front, the tension was rising. Callan's gasps had turned into a desperate, repetitive kicking against the seat in front of him. Thump, thump, thump. A man turned around, his face a mask of indignation. "Sir, can you please control your child?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Breck's control finally snapped. "He's not a piece of luggage," he shot back, his voice low and dangerous. "He's a terrified little boy." "Well, your terrified little boy is disturbing everyone," another passenger chimed in. This one was Garrison Finch, a man in a crisp suit who looked like he'd been born annoyed. He took a deliberate sip of his scotch. "Some of us paid a great deal for a peaceful flight." Breck felt his face flush with a mix of rage and humiliation. He was surrounded by people who saw his son's pain as an inconvenience, an interruption to their champagne service. He pulled Callan closer, trying to shield him from the hostile stares. but his touch only made the boy flinch, his small body coiling even tighter. Back in row 42, Cassie felt each thump in her own chest. She saw the curtain sway as a flight attendant hurried forward. She heard the sharp, entitled voices cutting through the air. She knew what was happening. They were surrounding the boy with their anger and their impatience. They were making the storm worse. She put her hand on her grandmother's arm. I think I can help," she said, her voice small but firm. Alara looked at her granddaughter's determined face. She saw the ghost of her husband's courage in Cassie's eyes. He had never been the loudest man in the room, but he had always been the strongest. He had taught Cassie that true strength wasn't about shouting. It was about showing up. "Go on, then," Alara said, giving her a gentle, reassuring nod. "Just be gentle." Cassie unbuckled her seatbelt. The click echoed in the quiet space between them. She stood up, a small, red-haired girl in a simple dress, and began the long walk down the aisle. She was walking toward a fire, not with a bucket of water, but with a piece of silence. And in the suffocating noise of first class, silence was the one thing nobody had thought to try. The walk was longer than she expected. Every row she passed, she felt eyes on her. People looked up from their magazines, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disapproval. A child from economy, wandering into their pristine sanctuary. It was a breach of protocol, a disruption of the natural order. She reached the thin curtain, the flimsy barrier between two different castes. She hesitated for only a second, then pushed it aside. The atmosphere hit her immediately. It was thick with tension. She saw the little boy, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes screwed shut. She saw the father, a handsome, powerful-looking man who now looked utterly defeated. And she saw the other passengers, their faces hard with judgment. A flight attendant stepped into her path, her smile thin and forced. "Honey, you need to go back to your seat," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "This section is for first-class passengers only." Cassie looked past the woman, her eyes fixed on the struggling child. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply said, with a quiet authority that made the flight attendant pause, "I know, but I think he needs me." Before the woman could protest further, Cassie slipped past her. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a frightened animal. She didn't head for the empty seat beside the boy. She knew that would be too much, too close. Instead, she knelt in the aisle, a few feet away, making herself small and unthreatening. Breck looked up, startled. "Who are you? What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice ragged with stress. He was ready to call for security, to have this strange child removed. This was the last thing he needed. Another complication, another pair of eyes watching him fail. Cassie didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. Her entire focus was on Callan. The boy was still kicking, still trapped in his silent scream. From her pocket, Cassie pulled out a small, smooth, gray stone. It was flat and perfectly worn, a worry stone her grandfather had carried with him for years. He had given it to her before he passed away. When the world gets too loud, he had told her, "You hold on to this. You feel how smooth and quiet it is. You just focus on the stone, and you let the noise fade away." She didn't offer the stone to the boy. She didn't say a word. She simply held it in her own palm and began to gently rub its surface with her thumb, back and forth, back and forth. It was a quiet, rhythmic, patient movement. She started to hum. It was not a song with words. It was a low, steady, single note. A sound so soft it was almost part of the engine's drone. It was a sound that asked for nothing. It demanded no attention. It was just there. A small island of peace in an ocean of chaos. Slowly, miraculously, the kicking stopped. Callan's frantic gasps began to soften. His rigid body relaxed, just a fraction. He opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, darting around the cabin, still seeing threats everywhere. Then, they landed on the small, red-haired girl kneeling in the aisle. They saw the stone in her hand. They heard the soft, steady hum. The change was imperceptible to most, but to Breck, it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. His son's breathing was still shallow, but it was evening out. The frantic energy was seeping away, replaced by a weary curiosity. Garrison Finch, the man with the scotch, let out an impatient snort. "What is this? Some kind of talent show? Get that kid out of the aisle." But this time, Breck's voice was different. It wasn't defensive. It was fiercely protective. He looked at Finch, his eyes cold as ice. "Be quiet," he said, the two words landing with the force of a physical blow. Then he turned back to the girl. He didn't understand what she was doing. He didn't understand how it was working. But for the first time in an hour, he felt a flicker of hope. He looked at this strange, quiet child, and in her calm focus, he saw a strength he had never known. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time, it wasn't a demand. It was a genuine question, filled with awe and desperation. Cassie finally looked at him. Her green eyes were clear and steady. "My name is Cassie," she said softly, and he just needed some quiet. The silence that followed Cassie's words was more profound than the absence of noise. It was a heavy, weighted thing, filled with the unspoken thoughts of everyone in the first-class cabin. The tension had not vanished. It had merely changed its shape. Before, it was the chaotic energy of a child's panic. Now, it was the focused, uncomfortable stillness of a dozen adults who had just witnessed something they could not categorize. Breck stared at the girl, his mind struggling to process the scene. Cassie. She had a name. She had a purpose. And in 5 minutes, she had erected a shelter of peace around his son that he had spent 3 years and a small fortune trying to build. He watched her thumb continue its steady, rhythmic journey across the smooth surface of the gray stone. He watched his son, Callan, whose eyes were now fixed on that simple, repetitive motion. The boy's body, once a rigid arch of terror, had softened. His head was now tilted in curiosity, his breathing slow and even. He was like a ship that had found a lighthouse in a storm. Breck felt a complex wave of emotions wash over him. There was gratitude, immense and overwhelming, that made his throat feel tight. But beneath it was a layer of sharp, stinging shame. He was the father. He should have been the lighthouse. He had tried everything the experts had suggested. Weighted blankets, noise-canceling headphones, distraction techniques, carefully prescribed medications that he hated but used out of desperation. None of it had ever worked this quickly, this completely. He had been trying to manage the storm, to contain it. This child hadn't tried to manage anything. She had simply offered a piece of quiet. He thought of his late wife, Eleanor. She had understood Callan in a way he never could. She had a well of patience that seemed bottomless. "He just feels things more deeply than we do, Breck," she used to say, her hand gently stroking Callan's back. "The world is too bright for him sometimes, too loud. Our job is just to be his shade, his quiet place." After she was gone, Breck had tried to be that quiet place, but his own grief, his own impatience, his own relentless need to fix things, always got in the way. He was a man of action and solutions, and he had come to realize, with a crushing certainty, that the one problem he cared about most in the world did not have a solution. It simply had to be loved. This small girl, a stranger from the back of the plane, seemed to understand that instinctively. She hadn't offered a solution. She had offered herself. The spell was broken by Garrison Finch. He cleared his throat loudly, a sound of pure, manufactured disapproval. "Well, this is all very touching," he said, setting his empty Scotch glass down with a sharp click. "But the aisle is not a nursery. Flight attendant, is this really acceptable?" Clara, the lead flight attendant, was frozen in place. She had been flying for 22 years. She'd handled medical emergencies, irate celebrities, and even an emergency landing once. But she had no protocol for this. The rules were clear. Passengers, especially children, were not allowed to sit or kneel in the aisle. It was a safety hazard. An unaccompanied minor from another cabin was a clear violation. Yet, the problem she had been sent to manage was now calm. The source of the disruption was now the source of the peace. She forced a professional smile and walked toward Cassie. "Okay, sweetie, that was very kind of you," she said softly, trying to coax her. "But you really do need to go back to your seat now. We need to keep the aisle clear." Cassie didn't look up. Her focus remained entirely on Callan, whose small hand had now tentatively reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch above the gray stone. "Not yet," Cassie whispered. "It's not time yet." "I'm sorry, but it is," Clara insisted, her voice a little firmer. The man in 4D, Garrison Finch, was watching her every move, a smug look on his face. He was a man who enjoyed seeing rules enforced, especially when they benefited him. Breck found his voice. "Let her stay," he said. It came out hoarser than he intended. Clara turned to him, her expression a mixture of sympathy and professional duty. Sir, I understand. But I can't. It's a federal aviation regulation. Then find an exception, Breck said, his old, commanding tone returning, but it was tempered with a new note of pleading. Look at him. My son. He's okay for the first time in an hour. Please, don't take that away. Garrison Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark. Oh, for heaven's sake. Are we just going to ignore the rules because a millionaire's kid threw a tantrum? He needs discipline, not a babysitter from Coach. The word tantrum hit Breck like a slap. He rose slightly from his seat, his body coiled with a protective anger he hadn't felt in years. My son, he said, his voice dangerously low, was not throwing a tantrum. He was terrified, and if you had an ounce of humanity, you would see the difference. Finch recoiled slightly, not expecting such a direct confrontation. He was used to people deferring to his confident bluster. He simply raised his hands in mock surrender. I'm just a man who believes rules are there for a reason. For everyone's safety. While the adults argued, their voices rising and falling like an anxious tide, Cassie remained in her bubble of calm. She could hear them, of course. She'd been hearing voices like Mr. Finch's her whole life. They were the voices of people who didn't understand her grandfather's quiet struggles. Why can't he just get over it? Why is he being so antisocial? They were the voices of impatience, of a world that moved too fast for people who needed to be still. Her grandfather had taught her how to handle those voices. Don't you mind them, Cassie girl, he'd say, whittling a piece of wood on his porch. They're like barking dogs on the other side of a fence. They make a lot of noise, but they can't get to you unless you walk over to their fence. You just stay on your own path. Her path, right now, was with this little boy. She saw his tiny fingers twitch, wanting to touch the stone but still too afraid. So, very slowly, she slid the stone off her palm and onto the clean, carpeted floor of the aisle, halfway between them. It was an offering, a bridge. Callan's eyes followed the stone. He leaned forward, his seatbelt the only thing holding him back. He made a small sound, the first intentional sound he had made since his panic began. He hummed, a faint echo of the note Cassie had been holding. The sound cut through the argument. Breck, Clara, and even Garrison Finch fell silent. They all looked at the child. Breck's heart ached with a fierce, protective love. He unbuckled his son's seatbelt. Callan immediately slid off the seat and crawled into the aisle. He didn't crawl toward Cassie. He crawled toward the stone. He stopped just before it, his eyes wide. Then, with the careful deliberation of a bomb disposal expert, he reached out and placed his entire hand flat on top of it. He felt its coolness, its smoothness, its solid, predictable reality. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and the last of the tension seemed to drain from his body. He looked up at Cassie, and for the first time, a flicker of connection appeared in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement. You see me. Tears welled in Breck's eyes. He quickly blinked them away, turning his head so no one would see. The sight of his son, grounded and calm, was more valuable to him than his entire company. More valuable than anything. Clara, the flight attendant, stood watching, her rulebook forgotten. She saw the profound relief on the father's face. She saw the boy, safe and peaceful on the floor. And she saw the quiet, red-haired girl who had orchestrated this small miracle. She made a decision. She turned to Garrison Finch, her professional smile gone, replaced by a look of firm resolution. Sir, she said, her voice polite but unyielding. The situation is now under control. I will handle it from here. I would appreciate it if you would enjoy the rest of your flight in peace. She then turned to Breck. The captain has been informed of the situation, she said, bending the truth slightly. He has authorized me to use my discretion to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. The girl can stay. I will bring a blanket and pillow for the boy. She gave Cassie a small, grateful smile. Would you like some juice, sweetie? Or a soda? Just some water, please, Cassie said, her voice barely a whisper. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was. The quiet victory settled over their small section of the plane. A few other passengers who had been watching exchanged soft smiles. One woman gave Breck a supportive nod. The atmosphere had shifted from one of annoyance to one of quiet wonder. Garrison Finch, however, stood in his seat, defeated and resentful. He pulled out his newspaper and snapped it open, creating a wall of paper between himself and the scene he so clearly disdained. Breck knelt in the aisle, opposite Cassie, with his son between them. He didn't know what to say. Thank you felt too small, too inadequate for what she had done. He looked at her, this child who carried an ancient wisdom in her quiet gaze. That stone, he said, his voice soft. Is it special? Cassie looked down at the smooth gray rock, now covered by Callan's small hand. It was my grandpa's, she said. He was a soldier. He told me it helped him remember how to be quiet on the inside when the world outside was too loud. Breck nodded slowly, a profound understanding dawning on him. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a technique. It was a legacy, a lesson passed down from a man who had known a different kind of war, a different kind of storm. He looked at his son, calm and safe on the floor of an airplane, and he looked at the girl who had guided him there. He realized he wasn't just in her debt. He was her student. And the first lesson was clear. Some battles could only be won by sitting on the floor and sharing the silence. The remainder of the flight passed in a strange and sacred quiet. The air, once crackling with hostility and stress, was now soft and still. It felt as if their small section of the plane had become a pocket of tranquility, cruising at 35,000 feet. Clara, the flight attendant, brought a plush first-class blanket and pillow. She didn't hand them to Breck. She gave them directly to Cassie. Cassie gently arranged the pillow on the floor for Callan, who had not moved from his spot. He was now leaning his head against the base of his father's seat, his small hand still resting on the gray stone. His eyes were heavy with a peaceful exhaustion. Cassie draped the blanket over him, her movements slow and deliberate, just like every other action she had taken. She didn't tuck him in with the fussy energy of an adult. She simply laid the blanket over him, a gentle offering of warmth. Breck watched from his seat, a silent observer of this quiet ritual. He had never seen his son accept comfort from a stranger. Most of the time, Callan barely accepted it from him. Yet here he was, surrendering to the calm brought by this girl. After bringing Cassie her water, Clara leaned down and spoke to Breck in a low voice. Sir, your son can stay there for now. We won't be hitting any turbulence for a while, but he will need to be back in his seat with the belt on for the landing. Of course, Breck whispered. Thank you. For everything. Clara gave a small, genuine smile. I didn't do anything, but you have a very special little girl looking after him. She glanced at Cassie, then walked away, leaving the three of them in their peaceful bubble. For a long time, no one spoke. Breck didn't want to break the spell. He was afraid that a single word might shatter the fragile peace Cassie had created. But his mind was a whirlwind of questions. He needed to understand. Cassie, he finally said, his voice barely disturbing the air. She looked up at him, her green eyes patient. Your grandfather, he began, searching for the right words. You said he was a soldier. Did he struggle after? Cassie nodded, her expression serious but not sad. It was a simple statement of fact. The world was loud for him, she repeated, using the phrase that was clearly the foundation of her understanding. He couldn't go to parades or fireworks. The grocery store was hard on busy days. He said it was like all the sounds and all the lights were trying to get inside his head at the same time. Breck felt a jolt of recognition. That was exactly how a child psychologist had described Callan's sensory processing disorder. Imagine a radio with no tuner, the doctor had said, picking up every station at once. That's your son's world. The doctor had charged him $800 for that metaphor. This girl was explaining it for free, with perfect, simple clarity. What did he do? Breck asked, leaning forward, hungry for the answer. How did he make it quiet? He didn't make the world quiet, Cassie said wisely. He just found the quiet things in it. He had a garden. He said you can't be in a hurry when you're waiting for a tomato to grow. And he liked fishing. Not catching fish, really. Just sitting by the water, watching the line. And he had his stone. She glanced at the rock under Callan's hand. He said as long as you have one quiet thing to hold on to, the loud things can't wash you away. One quiet thing to hold on to. The simplicity of it was staggering. Breck thought of the mountain of expensive, stimulating toys he had bought for Callan. iPads with calming apps, intricate building blocks, light-up globes that played soothing music. He had been trying to distract his son from the noise, to layer more sensation on top of the chaos. He had been fighting noise with more noise. The thought had never once occurred to him to simply subtract, to find a single point of silence and focus on it. Just then, a figure appeared at the curtain. It was Alara, Cassie's grandmother. She stood there for a moment, her face etched with a gentle concern, taking in the scene. Her granddaughter on the floor, the sleeping boy, the powerful man in the expensive suit looking at Cassie as if she held all the answers in the universe. Clara intercepted her with a warm smile. "It's all right, ma'am. You can come through." Alara walked forward, her footsteps soft. She knelt beside Cassie, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Are you doing okay, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, Grandma," Cassie whispered. "He's just resting." Alara looked at Breck, her eyes kind but direct. She did not seem impressed by his suit or the first-class surroundings. She looked at him as a fellow traveler, a fellow guardian. "I hope she hasn't been a bother." Breck shook his head, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "A bother? Ma'am, your granddaughter. She's a miracle worker." "She's not a miracle worker," Alara corrected him gently, though her tone was not scolding. "She's just a good listener. She learned it from the best." Her gaze softened as she looked at the sleeping form of Callan. "My husband, Thomas, he was a lot like your boy here. Big and strong on the outside, but the world was a hard place for him to be sometimes. He carried a lot of noise inside him from his time in the service." Breck found himself speaking with a candor he rarely used with anyone, let alone a complete stranger. "My wife, Eleanor, she was the one who understood him. She was his quiet place. Since I lost her, I've been failing. I try to fix him, but I think I just make the noise louder." The admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Alara nodded, a deep and knowing sympathy in her eyes. "You can't fix a person like you fix a machine, sir. You can only sit with them in the dark until they're ready to see the light again." Cassie learned how to do that. She learned to just sit with her grandpa. That's all this is. She's just sitting with him. A few rows back, Garrison Finch lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowed in disapproval at the sight of the grandmother now joining the nursery in the aisle. He signaled for a flight attendant, his finger jabbing the call button with aggressive repetition. A different attendant, a young man named Ben, hurried over. "Yes, sir? Can I get you something?" "Yes," Finch said in a loud, carrying whisper. "You can tell me when this flight is going to return to normal." Now there are two of them from the back of the plane camped out in the aisle. It's ridiculous. I paid for a first-class ticket, not a seat in a waiting room. Ben glanced nervously toward the front, where Clara was now standing, watching over the scene like a sentinel. He saw the sleeping child and the peaceful group. "Sir, the situation is under control," he said politely. "It is not under control. It's an embarrassment," Finch hissed. "Get your supervisor." Ben quickly fetched Clara. She approached Finch's seat, her posture radiating a calm authority. "Mr. Finch, is there a problem?" "There is," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "This is a gross violation of your own rules. It's a safety issue, and frankly, it's disruptive to those of us who would like to enjoy the service we paid for." Before Clara could respond, a woman's voice cut through the air from the row behind Breck. It was the woman in the pearls, the one who had initially given Breck a look of annoyance. Her name was Beatrice, and she was a retired schoolteacher. "Oh, for goodness sake, leave them alone," she said, her voice clear and firm. "That little girl has done more for that child than anyone else could. It's the most decent thing I've seen on a plane in 20 years. If you can't appreciate a simple act of kindness, then perhaps you're the one who is disruptive." Finch turned in his seat, his face flushing a deep red. "I beg your pardon." An older man across the aisle, who had been silently reading a book, looked up over his glasses. "She's right," he said in a quiet, authoritative voice. "Let it be. The boy is sleeping. The father is relieved. Let them have their peace." Defeated by the sudden alliance of his fellow passengers, Finch sank back into his seat, fuming. He muttered something under his breath about writing a letter to the airline, but his power over the cabin was broken. The quiet majority had spoken, and they had sided with kindness. Breck had heard the exchange. He caught Beatrice's eye and gave her a nod of profound gratitude. She simply smiled back, a warm, understanding expression on her face. In that moment, the sterile, anonymous space of first class felt less like a collection of isolated individuals and more like a community. A temporary, fragile community brought together by one child's panic and another's quiet courage. He turned his attention back to Alara and Cassie. Callan had stirred in his sleep, his small hand tightening its grip on the stone. "We're flying to Seattle to dedicate a plaque for him," Alara said softly, continuing their conversation as if the interruption hadn't happened. At the Veterans Memorial Garden. It's just a small thing, but it was important for Cassie to be there. He deserved more than a plaque, Breck said, his voice thick with emotion. What he taught your granddaughter? What she just taught me? You can't put a price on that. Thomas never cared for monuments or money, Alara said with a gentle smile. He used to say that the only legacy that matters is the kindness you leave behind in other people. The quiet things. Breck looked at his sleeping son, then at the small, gray stone, and finally at the 11-year-old girl with the old soul. A new idea was beginning to form in his mind, a solution that had nothing to do with code or contracts or leverage. It was a different kind of investment, one that paid dividends in a currency he was only just beginning to understand. The plaque for Sergeant Thomas Rowan was a fine tribute, but Breck knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it wasn't enough. The legacy of a man like that, a legacy that could calm a storm on a plane 35,000 feet in the air, deserved to be more than just a name on a wall. It deserved a garden of its own. An hour later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and practiced, a sound designed to inspire confidence. Folks, as we begin our initial descent into the Seattle area, flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. The announcement was a linguistic trigger, a piece of procedural code that signaled the end of a journey. The gentle, consistent hum of the engines, which had become a kind of white noise for the cabin, began to change its pitch. The plane banked, a slow, graceful tilt that was almost imperceptible, yet the shift in gravity was a fundamental change in the world's rules. For most passengers, these were routine, barely noticeable sensations. For Callan, it was a seismic event, a betrayal by the very air holding him up. He stirred on the floor, his peaceful exhaustion evaporating in an instant. His eyes fluttered open, wide and unfocused. The change in pressure was a strange popping in his ears. The subtle gravitational pull felt like a giant hand pressing down on him. A new, higher-pitched whine began to emanate from the wings as the flaps adjusted. It was a fresh and sudden assault of sensory information, and his defenses were down. A low, guttural whimper escaped his lips, and his small body began to tense, the old, familiar patterns of panic threatening to surge and reclaim him. Breck's heart leaped into his throat, a frantic, painful thud against his ribs. Not now, he pleaded silently, a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. Please, we were so close. His muscles tensed with a decade of ingrained habit. His first instinct was to grab his son, to physically restrain the panic, to impose order through force, a tactic that had never once worked, yet was always his first, failing impulse. But before he could move, a small, soft hand on his arm stopped him. It was Cassie. She shook her head, a minute, deliberate gesture. Her green eyes were perfectly calm, completely focused. It's okay, she whispered, her voice a thread of certainty in the rising tension. It's just a new sound. The plane is just talking. She didn't try to move Callan. She didn't try to shush him or force him back into his seat. That would have been pouring gasoline on the fire. Instead, she slid off her seat and knelt beside him again, bringing herself down to his level. She leaned close to his ear, her fiery red hair brushing his cheek, and began to hum again. It was the same low, steady, single note from before, a human drone that seemed to seek out the engine's new frequency. She wasn't trying to block out the sound. She was joining it, absorbing it, weaving it into her circle of calm and rendering it harmless. She picked up the gray stone, which had rolled a few inches away when Callan stirred. She didn't just hand it to him. She closed his own small, trembling fingers around it, making sure he could feel its weight, its smooth, unchanging reality. Hold on to the quiet, she murmured, her voice a soft anchor in a shifting, tilting world. The quiet is stronger than the noise. Callan's whimpering subsided. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the stone, a desperate, last-ditch hold on a piece of solid ground. But his breathing, which had started to hitch in the telltale rhythm of hyperventilation, began to even out. He was still scared, but he wasn't lost anymore. He was tethered. Clara, the flight attendant, approached them, her face a mask of gentle urgency. Sir, I'm truly sorry, but he has to be in his seat now. We're on final approach. It is the most critical phase of the flight for safety. Breck nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He looked at Cassie, a silent question in his eyes. A plea. How do we do this without breaking the peace? How do we move him from this safe harbor back into the storm of the seat? Cassie understood completely. She looked at Callan, not with pity, but with a deep, practical empathy. It's time to sit in the big chair now, she said softly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The plane wants to give us a hug when it lands. The belt is the hug, but the stone can come with us. And I'll be right here. She pointed to the empty seat across the aisle from him. It was Garrison Finch's seat. Finch, in a final, theatrical act of displeasure, had demanded to be moved to the only other available seat in the cabin, next to the galley, muttering about his rights as a Platinum Medallion member. The seat was a silent trophy to Cassie's victory. Breck carefully lifted Callan. The boy was limp but not resistant, a sign of trust so profound it made Breck's arms tremble. He placed him in the plush leather seat and fastened the seatbelt, making it snug but not tight. Callan's eyes were wide, darting nervously at the window, but he was holding on, both literally and figuratively. Cassie slipped into the seat across from Callan. She didn't buckle her own belt right away. Instead, she held her own hands in her lap and began to rub her thumbs together in the same slow, rhythmic, circular way she had rubbed the stone. Callan watched her, his terrified eyes locking onto the simple, repetitive motion. It was a mirror of the calm he held in his own hand. A visual lifeline that said, "I'm doing it too. We're doing it together." The plane dipped and swayed as it cut through the thick Pacific Northwest cloud cover. Suddenly, the gray nothingness outside the window gave way to the city lights of Seattle, a glittering, endless carpet of man-made stars. For the first time in his young life, Callan looked out the window of a landing airplane without screaming. He saw the lights. He felt the movement of the air. He heard the roar of the engines. But he also saw the girl. And he held the stone. And for now, that was enough. The wheels touched the tarmac with a loud chirp and a shudder that ran through the fuselage. Callan flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but Cassie didn't break her rhythm. She just gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. See, that was the hug. We're okay. As the plane taxied toward the gate, a collective, unspoken sigh of relief went through the first-class cabin. Passengers began to gather their belongings, the spell of the shared, intense experience slowly breaking as they prepared to return to their separate, individual lives. But something had fundamentally changed. The glances they sent toward Breck and Callan were no longer annoyed or judgmental. They were soft, filled with a quiet, humbled respect. Beatrice, the retired teacher with the pearl necklace, leaned over as she prepared to deplane. "You have a wonderful son," she said to Breck, her voice warm and genuine. Then she looked at Cassie, her eyes full of wonder. "And you, young lady, are a very old soul." Cassie just smiled, a shy, fleeting expression that was gone as quickly as it appeared. When the final, authoritative ding of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin, Breck unbuckled a now sleepy Callan. He looked at Cassie, who was waiting patiently, as if she knew this wasn't over. "Don't go anywhere," he said, the words a command and a plea at once. "Please, wait for us." The baggage claim at Seattle-Tacoma Airport was the full, chaotic expression of the loud world Cassie's grandfather had struggled against. The air was a cacophony of rumbling carousels, garbled announcements, crying babies, and the impatient chatter of 1,000 simultaneous conversations. It was a place of anxious energy, of people in a hurry to be somewhere else. It was the exact opposite of the quiet, sacred space that had been created on the plane. Breck, with a drowsy Callan perched on his hip, stood beside Cassie and Alara, feeling utterly out of place. The contrast between them was stark and revealing. Breck, in his bespoke suit that now felt like a costume, a man who commanded an army of employees, looked like any other tired, overwhelmed father. Alara, in her simple cardigan and practical shoes, stood with a quiet dignity that the surrounding chaos could not touch. Cassie was just being Cassie, her observant eyes taking in the whirling river of people and luggage without judgment. I truly don't know how to thank you," Breck began, his voice strained with the emotion of the day. He felt clumsy, inadequate. The vocabulary of gratitude he possessed was built for business deals and professional favors, not for soul-saving acts of grace. "What you did for my son, for me, it was monumental." He reached for his wallet, an old, ingrained habit, the instinct of a man for whom money had always been the universal solvent. "Please," he said, his hand fumbling with the leather. "Let me compensate you for your time, for your grandmother's flight. Let me buy you dinner, get you a private car service to your hotel. Anything. Name it." The offer, as soon as it left his lips, felt crude and small, like trying to catch the ocean in a teacup. Alara held up a hand, a gentle but firm gesture that stopped him cold. "Sir, that's very kind of you, but it isn't necessary. We don't need payment for helping someone who was hurting." She said it with such simple finality that there was no room for argument. "But I need to do something," Breck insisted, a note of desperation in his voice. This wasn't about clearing a debt. It was about honoring the magnitude of the gift they had given him. This was not a small thing. "You gave me back a piece of my son today. You have to let me do something." Alara's expression softened. "My husband, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle, "was once offered a reward by a man whose car he pulled from a ditch in a snowstorm." Thomas just smiled and told him, "Kindness isn't a job, son. It's a reflex. You don't get paid for a reflex. The best way to thank us," she concluded, "is to just remember the lesson." That's all Thomas would have wanted. Breck knew she was right, but it didn't feel like enough. The world he came from operated on transactions, on reciprocity. A gift of this size required a gesture of equal weight. He couldn't just walk away and let them disappear back into the crowd. "Your grandfather," he said, turning his focus to Cassie. "Sergeant Thomas Rowan. You're here for his plaque dedication." Cassie nodded. "Tomorrow morning, at the Memorial Garden." "I'd like to come," Breck said, the idea taking firm root in his mind, feeling more right than any business decision he had ever made. "If that's all right, I'd like to pay my respects." Alara looked surprised, but she saw the raw sincerity in his eyes. This wasn't a powerful man making a polite gesture. It was a humbled man making a pilgrimage. "Of course," she said. "We would be honored." He pulled out a sleek, minimalist business card. "This has my personal cell number. Please, call me. Let me at least arrange for a car to take you there. No arguments," he added quickly, seeing Alara about to protest. "It's not payment. It's a small gesture of respect for a great man I wish I could have known." Alara finally relented with a gracious nod. As their bags appeared on the carousel, they exchanged information. The interaction was brief, but a powerful, unspoken bond had been forged between the millionaire, the veteran's widow, and the quiet, red-haired girl. As they parted ways, Cassie turned back. She walked up to Callan, who was now hiding his face in his father's shoulder, overwhelmed by the noise of the terminal. She held out her hand. In her palm was the smooth, gray stone. "Here," she said softly. "I think you need this more than I do now." Callan peeked out from the safety of his father's neck. He looked at the stone, then at Cassie. He slowly reached out his small hand and took it. His fingers closed around it, a silent, solemn acceptance of a sacred trust. Tears sprang to Breck's eyes. He could only mouth the words, "Thank you." Cassie gave a final, small smile and rejoined her grandmother, melting into the crowd. Breck watched them go, a small girl and an old woman who possessed a form of wealth he was only just beginning to comprehend. He looked down at his son, who was holding the stone as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. In that moment, Breckenridge Davenport, the master of a digital empire, felt like the poorest man in the airport. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had to change that. The next day, Breck and Callan stood at the back of a small crowd gathered in the Seattle Veterans Memorial Garden. It was a beautiful, somber place, filled with granite walls etched with names and manicured lawns bordered by whispering trees. Callan was quiet, holding his father's hand with one hand and the gray stone in the other. He seemed to understand the respectful hush of the place. Breck saw Cassie and Alara standing near the front. A man in a crisp army dress uniform was at a lectern, speaking about Sergeant Thomas Rowan's distinguished service, his bravery, his sacrifice for his country. He spoke of medals and commendations, of valor in the face of the enemy. It was a fine speech, hitting all the right notes of public heroism. But Breck knew, with a clarity that felt like a revelation, that the man was missing the most important part of the story. The true measure of the sergeant's bravery wasn't on a battlefield in a foreign land. It was in the quiet, patient, daily battles he fought when he came home. It was in the legacy of peace he had cultivated on his porch and passed down to his granddaughter. a legacy that was, at this very moment, keeping a little boy from falling apart. After the ceremony, after the small bronze plaque bearing Thomas Rowan's name was revealed, Breck approached them. He gave Alara a respectful nod and then knelt to be on eye level with Cassie. "Your grandfather was a true hero," Breck said, his voice full of conviction. "I know," Cassie said simply, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "He was my grandpa. I did some research last night," Breck continued, his voice dropping slightly, full of a new, focused energy. "This garden is beautiful, but it's loud. It's next to a 6-lane highway. The city is all around it. It's a place for monuments, for names on a wall. It's a place to remember the soldier. It's not a place for the quiet he taught you about." Alara and Cassie looked at him, their expressions puzzled. "I spoke to my foundation's board this morning," Breck said, the words coming faster now, filled with a passion he hadn't felt for a project in years. "We're acquiring a piece of land. 5 acres, by a lake, about 30 minutes from here. It's quiet there. All you can hear are the birds and the water." He pulled a rolled-up piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It wasn't a business document. It was a preliminary architectural sketch, soft and rendered in charcoal. "We're going to build a different kind of memorial, not just for your grandfather, but for all the veterans and their families who come home carrying the noise. A place to heal." He unrolled the sketch for them. He pointed to a spot on the drawing, a gentle slope leading down to a calm shoreline. "We'll call it Rowan's Quiet Garden. There will be a sensory-friendly playground for kids like Callan, with no loud noises or bright, flashing lights. A quiet fishing dock where no one cares if you catch anything. A workshop for people to learn how to do things with their hands, like whittling or gardening. A place for people to find their own quiet things." He paused, his eyes locking with Cassie's. "And in the very center," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we're going to build a small, simple structure. A quiet room, with soundproof walls and soft light. And the path leading to it will be lined with thousands of smooth, gray stones, gathered from the lake shore. Anyone who visits can pick one up and hold onto the quiet." Alara covered her mouth with her hand, a soft sob escaping. Her tears weren't for her husband's death, but for the profound understanding of his life. Cassie stared at the drawing, her expression unreadable at first. Her eyes traced the lines of the garden, the workshop, the path of stones. Then, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. It was a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it lit up the entire somber day. "A whole garden of quiet," she whispered, the words full of wonder and recognition. Breck nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his own cheek. "It's the least I can do," he said. "I spent years trying to build walls to protect my son from the world. You and your grandfather taught me I should have been building a garden instead." His gaze shifted from the drawing to the small girl who had completely re-architected his world in the aisle of an airplane. "Your grandfather's legacy shouldn't just be a plaque on a wall. It should be a place where people can find the peace he fought so hard to give others." He had started the journey as a millionaire, a man who thought he could buy anything. But he was ending this day as something far more valuable. He was the keeper of a promise, the builder of a quiet place, a father who had finally learned how to listen. And it was all thanks to a shy little girl, the granddaughter of a legendary veteran, who knew that the most powerful thing in a loud, chaotic world wasn't a shout, but a whisper. It was the unexpected, profound, and healing power of a shared and simple silence. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.